The 92nd floor of the Smith Tower sat so high above Manhattan that the rest of the city felt like a miniature skyline trapped in glass. From here, the Hudson shimmered like a brushed steel ribbon. Taxis were no bigger than toy cars, and the endless thrum of New York could only be guessed through the silent view. The penthouse was all white marble glass and chrome, yet there were traces of someone's softer touch. Fresh lilies in a crystal vase, the scent of coffee drifting from the open-plan kitchen, a plaid throw folded neatly over the back of a cream leather couch. That someone was Genevieve Miller. She had once been the golden girl of MIT's natural sciences program, sharp-eyed, brilliant, and on track for a fully funded PhD in quantum materials. Her professors said she was born to leave a mark in scientific history. But 4 years ago, she had stood in this very penthouse, looked into Christopher Smith's ice-blue eyes, and decided she could live without the rest of the world, but not without him. It was a decision that had redefined her life. Every day since she had built her hours around his. At 5 a.m., she woke before the city stirred, moving through the kitchen, like a quiet ritual, slicing ripe strawberries for the parfaits he liked in summer, whisking eggs into the perfect texture for his omelets in winter. She measured the coffee grounds to the exact gram, because she knew how sensitive his taste was to bitterness, and set the French press on the marble counter, timing it to finish just as he emerged from his shower. Her love was not loud. It was methodical, disciplined, almost scientific in precision. She managed deliveries, oversaw the household staff, and even glanced over prototype reports from the Smith Technologies R&D department, making notes in the margins when she saw potential flaws. More than once, an engineer had followed one of Miss Miller's small suggestions and shaved weeks off a project timeline. But for the world outside these glass walls, she didn't exist. Christopher's name was printed in bold on every business magazine cover, paired with glossy photos of him at product launches, charity galas, and private soirees. He was the man who could command a room with a glance, who turned the heads of women in couture gowns and men with their fortunes. At 35, he was worth over $12 billion and had been nicknamed the Crowned Wolf of Wall Street for the way he devoured corporate competition. And Genevieve, his constant, his anchor, was invisible. It wasn't that Christopher didn't acknowledge her. In private, he could be charming and attentive. But under the golden lights of New York's most exclusive venues, his attention wandered like an untethered yacht. The first time she saw him place a proprietary hand on a young assistant's waist at a gala in the Waldorf Astoria, Genevieve told herself it was harmless, a calculated move to project charisma in a world that ate politeness alive. The second time, she told herself she was being insecure. By the fifth, she stopped telling herself anything at all. The Waldorf's grand ballroom was at its most radiant that February night. Crystal chandeliers cast light like champagne bubbles, music floated from a live jazz quartet, and the air smelled faintly of truffle canapes and expensive perfume. In a tailored charcoal suit, Christopher looked like the image on a magazine cover came to life. In a floor-length emerald gown, Genevieve stood beside him like the quiet shadow of his success. And then came the new assistant, tall, fair-haired, wearing a dress that clung like it had been sewn onto her. Genevieve watched Christopher lean in his hand on the small of the young woman's back, his lips too close to her ear. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the smile, slow, indulgent, the same one he used to give her when she was still new to this world. She set her champagne flute down the stem, trembling slightly in her hand. At the edge of the ballroom, a cluster of Christopher's old boarding school friends noticed her expression. "Please don't look so worried," one of them said, swirling his whiskey with a lazy smirk. "Smith's women don't leave for long. She'll be back in 5 days tops." Another laughed, adding, "Hell, maybe 5 hours. She's a good one, quiet, loyal, knows how to behave." The words landed with the dull thud of reality. To them, she wasn't a person. She was an object, a fixture in Christopher's life. Like the Italian leather chairs in his office, meant to stay put, serve a purpose, and not demand the spotlight. Genevieve felt the walls of the ballroom closing in. The chandeliers seemed suddenly too bright, the air too thick. She excused herself with the poise she had perfected over 6 years, slipping past servers and guests until she found the ladies' powder room. Inside, she leaned against the cool marble counter, her reflection sharp in the mirror. She looked perfect hair in soft waves, lipstick, a subtle crimson gown draped elegantly over her frame. But her eyes betrayed her. They were tired, not from work, but from the slow erosion of something she had once believed was unshakable. She remembered the night years ago when Christopher had convinced her to stay in New York instead of going to Switzerland for her doctoral research. "We'll build something together," he had said, "not just a life, an empire." She believed him. And now she realized empires could be cages. Too beautiful, golden cages where you forgot what the sky looked like without glass between you and the clouds. When she returned to the ballroom, Christopher was already at the center of a laughing circle, his arm still casually resting on the assistant's waist. He looked over, met her gaze for half a second, and gave her the practiced smile that said, "Play along." She did, because in that moment, walking out in front of all those eyes would have been the kind of rupture you couldn't stitch closed in public. And Genevieve had learned to measure her moves like she measured her coffee grounds, precise, deliberate. But inside, something shifted, a hairline crack in the glass tower. The penthouse was silent when they returned past midnight. Christopher went straight to his study, answering emails with the efficiency of a man whose life revolved around stock charts and acquisition offers. Genevieve removed her earrings, set them in their velvet box, and hung her gown carefully in the cedar-lined closet. She stood momentarily at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city. Millions of lights blinked, offices, apartments, street lamps, all with their little worlds inside. And she wondered, not for the first time, what her world would have looked like if she had chosen differently. She didn't yet know that this crack in her illusion would widen. It would let in both the sting of betrayal and the breath of freedom. For now, she only knew one thing: once you started questioning the walls of your glass tower, you could never unsee them. If you've ever felt the quiet weight of a love that asks you to dim your light, tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Genevieve's place? And if you want to see where her story goes from here, make sure you like this video, follow our channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Your dreams are never too far gone to take back. The rain had begun just as the limousine pulled away from the Waldorf Astoria. Manhattan shimmered in streaks of gold and red through the tinted glass, the city's lights warped and blurred by the water on the windows. The air was still thick with champagne and expensive perfume, though neither spoke. Christopher sat across from her, one leg crossed over the other, scrolling through something on his phone with the cool detachment of a man reviewing stock prices. In the opposite seat, Genevieve kept her hands folded in her lap, the emerald satin of her gown smooth and untouched. She had mastered the art of silence long ago, how to fill it with grace instead of tension. But tonight, silence had teeth. When the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, she stepped out first, her heels soft against the marble. Christopher followed, pausing only to slip his phone into his jacket pocket. "Sit," he said, not as an invitation, but more as an instruction. Genevieve lowered herself onto the edge of the white leather sofa. He crossed to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a slim leather checkbook. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if this were just another business transaction. She watched the pen glide across the paper, his penmanship precise without faltering. When he tore the slip from the book, the sound was sharp in the quiet room. He held it out between two fingers. $5 million. No name in the memo line. No sentiment. Only the date and the number, as if the 6 years between them could be quantified so neatly. Her eyes moved from the check to his face. "What is this? Consider it." "An exit package," he said. "You've been with me a long time. You've contributed. I'm not heartless." Something in her chest twisted, not at the money, but at how he said it, as though she had been nothing more than a line item in his ledger, an investment he was now cashing out. "You think I'll take this and come running back?" she asked, her voice quiet. His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll be back on your own. You always are." For a moment she almost laughed, because there it was, the truth of how he saw her. Predictable, contained, a loyal shadow that always found her way back to his light, no matter how cold it grew. But this time, something in her had shifted beyond repair. She reached out not for the check, but the black leather envelope on the coffee table. Inside was a slim folder of documents, her passport, birth certificate, and degrees. She had gathered them quietly over the past month, each piece a brick in the road away from here. "You're right," she said, rising to her feet. "I am leaving, but not the way you think." His brows drew together slightly, the first crack in his composure. "Genevieve." She didn't wait for the rest. Her heels clicked against the marble as she crossed to the bedroom. In 15 minutes, the emerald gown had been replaced by dark jeans and a wool coat, her hair pulled into a low knot. She moved through the penthouse with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times. The night air from the service elevator cooled her skin when she stepped into the hallway. The check was still on the table behind her. She hadn't touched it. The cab ride to her apartment in Chelsea was a blur of city lights and half-formed thoughts. By the time she turned the key in her door, exhaustion had wrapped around her bones. She leaned against the wood, listening to the hum of her refrigerator, the faint hiss of the radiator. For the first time in years, she was alone in a space that belonged entirely to her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A name lit the screen: Adrian Bennett. Adrian had been a constant in the background of her life, a friend from her early days at MIT, now a rising star in molecular physics at Harvard. They hadn't seen each other in person in over a year, but they had kept in touch through short emails and the occasional phone call. She answered on the second ring. "Adrian, I was just about to email you when his warm, steady voice came through. But then I thought, why wait? I read the symposium proceedings from Zurich. They're still using your early lattice models." "You should have been there, Genevieve." She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the door. "I've been occupied." "I know," he said gently. "But if you've ever thought about coming back, I might have something for you." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "You always know when to call." There was a pause. "Then I've spoken to Dr. Eleanor Pierce." The name hit her like a spark. Eleanor Pierce was more than a decorated physicist. She was a legend and one of the most respected figures in applied materials science. Genevieve had once been shortlisted for a place in her research group, but left the offer to stay in New York. "She's opening applications for her graduate lab." Adrian continued. "It's competitive, cutthroat, honestly, but she remembers you. She asked about you." The knot in Genevieve's chest loosened just slightly. Adrian said, "If you're serious, you'd need to prepare. Papers, proposals, interviews. It won't be easy, but I'll help you." She was silent momentarily, staring at the floor where the city's sodium streetlights spilled through the blinds. 6 years ago, she had been ready to dedicate her life to science. 6 years ago, she'd traded that future for a man who had just tried to end their story with a slip of paper and a number. "Send me everything," she said at last. "I'm ready." The weeks that followed became a quiet, relentless rhythm. Morning coffee at the small desk in her apartment. Hours buried in research journals, annotating margins in the same meticulous handwriting she'd once used for Christopher's prototype reports. Evenings on video calls with Adrian, dissecting the latest breakthroughs in composite materials. Occasionally, she would catch herself glancing at the corner of her desk where the check might have been if she had taken it. But there was nothing there, and she didn't regret it. On a cold March afternoon, she boarded a train to Boston. Snow flurries streaked the windows as the landscape shifted from city steel to Cambridge's muted brick and ivy. Adrian met her at the station, taller than she remembered, his scarf loose around his neck. "You look like someone who hasn't slept in weeks," he said, smiling as they hugged. "I haven't," she admitted, "but it feels good, like I'm moving forward." They walked across the Harvard yard, the air sharp with winter. Adrian led her to an office lined with bookshelves and a single large window in one of the older brick buildings. Behind the desk sat Dr. Eleanor Pierce, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a precise twist, her eyes bright and assessing. "So," Eleanor said, setting aside a stack of papers, "this is the one who vanished into the city for 6 years." Genevieve met her gaze without flinching. "Yes, ma'am. And I'd like to prove I haven't lost what I had back then." Eleanor's lips curved faintly. "We'll see. Talent is easy to waste, but not impossible to reclaim. If you want this, Miss Miller, you must show me." The interview lasted 2 hours. They spoke of crystallography, thin film fabrication, and the latest work in superconducting materials. Genevieve felt her mind stretching, waking up in ways it hadn't in years. By the end, Eleanor's expression had softened, not with warmth exactly, but with interest. "I'll be in touch," she said. On the train ride back to New York that night, Genevieve sat by the window, watching the blur of lights and snow. She realized she hadn't thought about Christopher for hours between Boston and the city. When she unlocked her apartment, the space felt different. Not larger, not warmer, but hers. Every inch of it. In the quiet, she opened her laptop, pulled up her old research folders, and began to work. The city murmured outside, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a shadow in someone else's story. She was writing her own again. The April wind in Cambridge smelled of thawing earth and new beginnings. Harvard Yard was waking from winter's long hold. Bare branches stretched toward a softening sky, and the red brick pathways glistened faintly from last night's rain. Genevieve stepped onto the campus with the quiet poise of someone who knew exactly how much she had changed. Her hair, once a cascade of loose curls, was now cut into a sharp, textured pixie that framed her cheekbones and drew attention to the superb clarity of her eyes. She wore a tailored dove-gray coat that fell just above the knee, a silk blouse in midnight blue, and slim black trousers that skimmed the line of her legs before ending in polished, low-heeled boots. It wasn't ostentation. It was control. Every detail said she was a woman who had chosen her shape. From the steps of Widener Library, a small knot of undergraduates, 3 young women in artfully layered cashmere and long scarves, turned their heads as she passed. They were the ones people called the Yard Goddesses, daughters of senators' heiresses, women who floated through the university like they owned it. They looked at Genevieve, then at each other, their posture shifting almost imperceptibly. It's not precisely hostility, more alertness when the hierarchy tilts even a fraction. She didn't break stride. Adrian was waiting for her in the lobby of the Science Center, his messenger bag slung casually over one shoulder. "You look—" He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound cliched. "Unmistakable." "That's the idea," she said, her lips curving faintly. They made their way to the amphitheater-style lecture hall where the spring symposium was being held, a gathering of faculty, postdocs, graduate students, and a handful of invited undergraduates. The air hummed with caffeine ambition and the low rustle of people finding seats. Dr. Eleanor Pierce was already at the front, her silver hair gleaming under the recessed lights. She stood beside a large whiteboard covered with a lattice of symbols, equations, and partial diagrams, a problem whose complexity was apparent even to those who didn't fully understand it. Adrian leaned closer and murmured, "You remember this one?" Genevieve's gaze moved over the notations. Recognition slid into place like the click of a lock, the anomalous coherence decay problem. It's been unsolved for 8 years. Since Zurich, he confirmed. Pierce likes to bring it out at symposiums mostly to watch people flounder. The lecture began with formalities, updates on research grants, announcements of publications, and a brief keynote from a visiting Nobel laureate. Then Eleanor stepped forward, gesturing toward the whiteboard. She said, "This is a problem that has eluded some of the best minds in the field for nearly a decade. It sits at the intersection of condensed matter physics and quantum field theory. Today, I'd like to open the floor. Anyone willing to attempt it?" A ripple of polite laughter moved through the audience. People exchanged looks that said, "Not a chance." And then Genevieve stood. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. She descended the steps to the front, her boots soundless against the carpet. Adrian's brows lifted, but he didn't call her back. Eleanor's expression didn't change, though her eyes sharpened. "Miss Miller, are you volunteering?" "I am," Genevieve said. Her voice carried calm and even. She picked up a marker, and the smell of solvent was sharp in the warm air. She looked at the equations for a moment, not as an outsider trying to decipher them, but as someone listening for the faint hum beneath the notes, a melody only she could hear. Then she began. The first line was a subtle, almost surgical correction, replacing a flawed assumption about boundary conditions with a modified term. Gasps, quiet but audible, moved through the room. She didn't look up. The second line extended a derivation abandoned years ago for being too unstable. Still, she anchored it with an approach from an entirely different subfield, something from her early work in lattice vibration models. Minutes passed. The room had gone utterly silent except for the squeak of the marker. She moved with the grace of a dancer who had rehearsed in her mind for years, each gesture purposeful, each stroke of ink a step forward. She stepped back when she reached the final transformation, uncapping the last variable, with a notation so simple it almost seemed anticlimactic. The equation is balanced, perfectly. She recapped the marker and placed it on the ledge. The silence stretched for a heartbeat longer before breaking into a low roar of voices, startled, impressed, disbelieving. Eleanor walked to the board, reading through each step. Then she turned to face Genevieve. "How long have you been sitting on that solution?" 6 years, Genevieve said quietly. "I didn't have a reason to finish it until now." A faint smile tugged at the older woman's mouth. Not approval exactly, but something close. "Well, I think you've just earned yourself a reason to come back correctly." She addressed the room. "Miss Miller will join the doctoral program's candidate pool this fall. I expect the rest of you to take note." It was a public anointing, and everyone knew it. Afterward, the air felt thinner in the hallway outside the lecture hall, the light brighter. Adrian caught up with her, his grin wide. "You do realize you just outperformed half the faculty." "I didn't do it to outperform anyone," she said. "I did it to remind myself who I am." They walked toward the courtyard. Students glanced at her as they passed, some with open admiration, others with guarded curiosity. The yard goddesses from earlier were among them. This time, their glances were sharper, more calculating. Genevieve didn't notice the tall man watching from the upper balcony of the Science Center, a man with ice-blue eyes, hands resting on the railing. He had arrived midway through the session on unrelated business, only to find his gaze caught by the woman at the board. Christopher Smith didn't yet know her name in this new context, but he recognized the posture, the voice, the way she moved when she was in her element. And for the first time in years, He realized he might not be the center of her world anymore. Spring in Cambridge should have been Genevieve's season of quiet momentum. Her days were filled with research proposals, late-night study sessions with Adrian, and a mind sharpened by the challenge of the doctoral candidacy process under Dr. Eleanor Pierce's watch. The whispers on campus were still there about the woman who had walked into a symposium and solved an 8-year-old problem, but they were whispers of awe, not malice. Until the first headline appeared. It was on a glossy digital tabloid that thrived on scandal and insinuation. Her photograph, cropped from a Harvard event, was paired with bold, poisonous text: MIT dropout uses billionaire's bed to leapfrog into Harvard. Within hours, the story had metastasized across the internet. Every detail had been twisted into a narrative of calculated seduction and opportunism. They dredged up old photographs of her with Christopher at charity galas, speculating that she had used her looks to gain influence. Anonymous sources claimed she had been seen having dinner with a senior professor, a man who happened to be on the candidacy committee. The most grotesque accusation came from a gossip segment on a cable news show. Our sources allege that Genevieve Miller, the billionaire's former mistress, has been engaging in quid pro quo relationships, sleeping with committee members in exchange for favorable grading. Genevieve stared at the screen in Adrian's apartment, the coffee in her hand going cold. She murmured that they're trying to strip me of credibility before the results are even out. Adrian muted the television. His jaw was tight, his voice low. This reeks of Christopher's PR machine, and he hesitated of someone close to him feeding them details. The situation became clear 2 days later. A grainy paparazzi shot surfaced Christopher stepping out of the Beekman Hotel in Manhattan with a tall, willowy blonde clinging to his arm. Her name appeared in the captions Sloane Armitage, a publicist known for weaponizing gossip. Sloane's fingerprints were all over the smear campaign. And she wasn't working alone. Christopher's family had never liked Genevieve. His younger sister, Catherine Smith, had been polite to her in public, but icy in private. Her smiles calculated, her compliments edged with condescension. Catherine had her ambitions, particularly in academia. She had been admitted to a prestigious research program years ago, but rumors about her lack of merit had circulated quietly behind closed doors. Now Catherine was giving exclusive interviews about Genevieve's supposed moral failings. She spoke with faux sorrow, telling one magazine, "It's heartbreaking to see someone manipulate brilliant men in positions of influence. My brother's generosity was taken advantage of. And now she's targeting another academic figure. I hope the university investigates." Genevieve didn't respond publicly. Dr. Pierce had warned her. You answer gossip with silence, and you answer lies with facts. But Adrian wasn't bound by such restraint. One evening, over takeout and half-drunk mugs of tea, Adrian opened his laptop and said, "If they want to play dirty, fine. But they should remember who they're playing with." He began pulling files from an encrypted folder. Old emails, scanned invoices, financial records that had once been circulating quietly among faculty whispers. Catherine Smith. Adrian said, scrolling through documents, wasn't admitted to the Oxford Applied Sciences program on merit. She bribed the department head. "I have the proof." Genevieve's eyes widened. "Adrian?" He looked up. "I didn't dig for this. It came to me years ago. Someone on the inside was disgusted by it. I never used it because it wasn't my fight. But now, it's relevant." The next morning, Adrian went public, not through tabloids, but through a respected investigative journalist he trusted. The article that dropped 3 days later was meticulous. Bank transfers traced from a Smith family holding company to a private account in London. A leaked letter from the department head expressing gratitude for the generous contribution just days before Catherine's admission. Records of her subpar performance once enrolled. The headline was Surgical Academic Integrity in Question. Catherine Smith's Oxford admission under scrutiny. It hit like a detonation. Catherine's PR team scrambled, issuing statements about charitable donations and misinterpretations, but the evidence was damning. In the media's eyes, the once polished Smith family narrative had developed a resounding crack. By the time the doctoral program's examination phase began, the smear campaign had shifted tone. The tabloids tried to undermine Genevieve, but the louder conversation was now about Catherine's scandal. The distraction bought Genevieve room to work in peace, though peace in this case meant 14-hour days of written exams, lab practicums, and oral defenses, before panels of some of the most exacting minds in science. The final stage was an independent research challenge design and present a proposal for an original study in under a week, complete with preliminary data projections. It was meant to test ingenuity under pressure. Genevieve approached it with the same precision she'd once given to Christopher's R&D problems, but this time, every ounce of brilliance was hers to claim. She worked alone in a corner of the Pierce lab, her desk littered with scribbled calculations, cross-sectional diagrams, and stacks of reference journals. By the end of the week, she stood in front of the committee, her slides clean, her voice steady as she outlined a novel method for stabilizing high-temperature superconductors using engineered lattice defects. She fielded questions for nearly an hour, probing adversarial questions meant to find weaknesses. There were none. 2 weeks later, the results were posted. Genevieve Miller, highest score in the history of the program. She read the numbers twice, almost disbelieving. The perfect scores in every category weren't just rare, they were unheard of. Whispers began spreading immediately through the faculty corridors. This wasn't just a win, but a record that might stand for decades. That same afternoon, Dr. Pierce summoned her to the office. The silver-haired scientist didn't bother with preamble. "Caltech has reached out," she said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "They're offering you a complete research fellowship, housing stipend, unlimited lab access. It's the sort of offer most people would kill for." Genevieve took the envelope. The letterhead was crisp, the words formal. "We are pleased to offer you a fully funded doctoral research placement at the California Institute of Technology." For a moment, the room seemed to be still. "This isn't the end game," Miss Miller Pierce said. "It's the start of your real work. I suggest you decide whether you're ready for what comes next, because with this level of attention, someone will always be waiting to see you fall." Genevieve met her gaze. "I've already fallen once," she said. "I know how to get back up." By the time she stepped out into the courtyard, the air was warmer, the late afternoon sun brushing the red brick of Harvard Yard in gold. Students glanced at her as she passed, some in admiration, others in resentment. She knew a few had read every smear piece and still chose to believe them. That didn't matter now. The headlines had shifted again. Harvard candidate breaks record with perfect exam score. From scandal to scholarship. Genevieve Miller offered a full Caltech fellowship. Those headlines landed like a stone in Christopher's glass house in Manhattan. Watching the news feed from his corner office, he saw her face, confident, composed, untouchable. Sloane Armitage, perched on the edge of his desk, tried to make light of it. "She'll burn out. They all do." But Christopher didn't answer. For the first time since she'd left, a thought settled in his mind with quiet certainty. She was no longer his to predict, contain, or dismiss. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The magazine lay open on Christopher Smith's mahogany desk, its glossy pages reflecting the muted light of a gray Manhattan morning. It wasn't Forbes, Vanity Fair, or any of the publications that usually caught his attention. It was the International Journal of Advanced Materials Science, a periodical he had only ever glanced at when one of his company's engineers made a breakthrough. And there she was, Genevieve Miller. Captured mid-laugh in the cover photograph head, slightly tilted eyes lit with an unmistakable brilliance. She wore a simple black dress and no visible jewelry. Her only adornment was the thin white lanyard from the Caltech Symposium. Beneath her image, the headline read, "The Woman Who Rewrote the Rules of Superconductivity." Christopher's fingers lingered on the edge of the page. He had seen Genevieve in every imaginable setting, draped in silk at charity galas, curled barefoot on the penthouse sofa, with a book bent over his shoulder, explaining a technical flaw in a prototype. But this was different. This was her without him. And she had never looked more untouchable. For days afterward, the thought of her followed him like a ghost, through board meetings and investor calls. He remembered how she used to rise at dawn making coffee before disappearing into the quiet to sketch out calculations he barely understood. He remembered her laughter soft, like the sound of glass chimes in summer, and how she could walk into a room of strangers and somehow steady his restlessness. He also remembered the last time he'd seen her, the sterile pen click as he signed the $5 million check, sliding it across the table like a transaction. At the time, he had believed, no assumed, that she would be back. Everyone came back, except she didn't. Now she was on the cover of a scientific journal with the academic world bowing at her feet. The narrative in the press had shifted from a billionaire's mistress to a scientist in her own right. Every article emphasized her record-breaking scores, her full fellowship at Caltech, and her potential to change the field. And in each photograph, there was no trace of him. That more than anything unsettled Christopher. He instructed his assistant to arrange a meeting at Harvard not 3 days later with the dean or Pierce, but with Genevieve herself. "Make sure it's private," he added, his voice low, "and make sure she agrees to see me." The assistant hesitated. She might refuse. Then make it worth her time. His tone left no room for argument. Genevieve was in the engineering library when she received the message, "Christopher Smith requests a meeting." Location, private lounge, Harvard Faculty Club. Time today, 3 p.m. She stared at the screen for a long moment, thumb hovering over the decline button. Then with a sigh, she typed a short reply. "I'll come. 15 minutes only." The late afternoon sun spilled gold over the faculty club's old oak paneling when she arrived. Christopher was already there, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, his posture as controlled as ever. Yet there was something different in his eyes, a hesitation she had never seen before. "Genevieve," he said, rising to greet her. She sat opposite him, setting her leather portfolio on the table like a shield. 15 minutes, she reminded him. He gave a small, almost rueful smile. "You look different." "I am different." He leaned forward, forearms resting on the polished table. "I saw the cover. Read the article. You've done remarkable things." "Without you," she said evenly. He didn't flinch. "Yes, without me. Which is why I'm here. I want you back, Genevieve. Not just in my life, but in my world. Whatever you want, resources, funding a research team, you'll have it. A penthouse, a seat on the board, the kind of influence you could use to do anything you dream." Her laugh was short, without humor. "You think I'm still the woman who would trade my dreams for your world? You were happy once," he said quietly. "We were good together." "No," she corrected. "You were good at taking, and I was good at giving. That's not the same thing." The following evening, she received an unexpected call from Catherine Smith. The younger woman's voice was warm, almost syrupy. "Genevieve, I just wanted to say, it would be wonderful if you and Christopher found your way back to each other. You've both grown, which would mean much to the family. After all, appearances are important, and you've certainly improved yours." Genevieve let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "So this is about appearances. Well, public perception matters, especially after recent events. The Caltech Fellowship is impressive. Imagine how much more powerful your image would be if you were by Christopher's side. It would be mutually beneficial. Beneficial to you, Genevieve said. Not to me. Catherine's tone cooled. Don't be foolish. Opportunities like this don't come twice. That's where you're wrong, Genevieve replied. Real opportunities come when you build them yourself. And she ended the call. 2 days later, Christopher made one last attempt. He found her in the courtyard outside Pierce Hall, the spring air carrying the scent of blooming magnolias. Students passed by, some recognizing him instantly, their glances sharp with curiosity. Genevieve, he called, catching up to her. She turned, the sunlight catching in her cropped hair. Christopher. He searched her face. Why won't you even consider it? I can give you everything. You already did, she said softly. A penthouse in the clouds. A closet full of couture. A life that looked perfect from the outside. But it was a crystal cage, Christopher. And I've stepped out of it. His voice dropped. You're saying there's nothing I can do? She held his gaze. I'm saying there's nothing I want you to do. My life is mine now, and there is no reason, none at all, for me to go back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he nodded once, a slight movement that might have been missed. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The click of his shoes fading into the hum of campus life. That night in her small apartment near Harvard Square, Genevieve sat by the window, the city lights spread out like a constellation below. She thought of Christopher, of the man he was, and the man he might have been, and felt no anger or longing, only clarity. Some doors once closed are better left that way. Blue Water Springs lay between rolling green hills and mist-veiled ridges, a town known only to those wealthy to keep it off the tourist maps. The Bennett family had owned it for 3 generations, its mineral-rich hot springs and glassy blue pools, transforming the remote settlement into a private sanctuary for academics, artists, and those seeking the kind of silence money could buy. It was here, Adrian told her, that they could work in peace, away from the noise of Cambridge, the press, and the shadows of old wounds. Genevieve hesitated at first. She had deadlines, experiments waiting in the lab, and papers to refine. But when she stepped off the private shuttle, and the mountain air touched her skin, cool and fragrant with pine, she knew she had made the right choice. The days at Blue Water Springs began slowly, steam curling from the pools in the early morning, deer grazing at the forest edge, the distant echo of a piano from the central lodge. Between research sessions with Adrian's team, she would walk the winding paths that connected the springs to the main square, her mind loosening, ideas coming in long, unbroken threads. On the 3rd evening, as she crossed the stone bridge into the square, Genevieve noticed a subtle shift in the air. Conversations grew hushed, eyes darted discreetly toward the road. Then she saw the car, a deep graphite Bentley, rolling to a stop in front of the lodge. Christopher Smith stepped out first, tall and deliberate, his presence bending the attention of the square toward him, as if by gravity. But it wasn't his arrival that sent a ripple through her. It was the figure emerging from the other side. Sloane Armitage, immaculate in a cream silk dress, sunglasses pushed up into her sleek blonde hair, she rested her hand lightly on Christopher's arm, as though she had always belonged there. Genevieve felt no jolt of heartbreak, no rush of jealousy, only the cool awareness of a performance. He had brought Sloane here deliberately. She was the unspoken message. Look at what you've given up. That weekend, the town held its annual Spring Goddess Festival, a tradition dating back to the town's founding part, pageant part, concert part, celebration of the season's renewal. The main event was a performance night, where the so-called Goddess of Spring would be crowned not for beauty alone, but for the talent she shared on stage. Genevieve hadn't planned to attend, much less participate. She was in the back of the lodge's grand hall, sipping mineral water and conversing politely with one of Adrian's colleagues, when the host, a silver-haired man with a voice like velvet, paused mid-announcement and scanned the crowd. "There is someone among us tonight," he said, eyes crinkling in a smile, "whose brilliance in science is matched, I hear, by an equal brilliance in music. Miss Genevieve Miller, will you honor us with a song?" The spotlight found her before she could shake her head. Applause swelled, gentle, coaxing, insistent. She rose slowly, feeling Christopher's gaze from across the room, heavy and assessing. Sloane leaned toward him, whispering something that curved his lips into the faintest smirk. The pianist, a kindly man with quick hands, asked softly, "What will it be?" She thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "At last," she said, the Etta James classic, rich with longing and triumph. When the first notes curled through the air, the room stilled. Genevieve's voice was low and warm at first, a ribbon of sound that seemed to weave through the candlelight and polished wood. Each phrase unfurled with a quiet confidence, the kind that came not from performing for others, but from living every word she sang. By the time she reached the final verse, her voice had risen clear, powerful, filling every corner of the hall. And when the last note melted into silence, there was a heartbeat where no one moved. Then the applause broke, thunderous, the entire hall rising to its feet. In that standing ovation, Genevieve saw none of the old pitying smiles or polite applause reserved for someone's beautiful companion. This was respect. This was hers. Phones had been lifted halfway through the song, discreetly, at first, then openly. By morning, clips of her performance were everywhere. Instagram reels, Twitter threads, YouTube channels devoted to vintage jazz. One post captioned, "When the scientist sings like this," racked up hundreds of thousands of views in hours. The footage was unpolished, the sound imperfect, but the essence was there. A woman at the center of her own story, unshaken, luminous. Comments poured in. "She's giving us 1960s jazz club magic. A voice you feel in your bones. This woman just stole the whole night." Christopher had been watching from the moment she stepped on stage. At first, he'd been smug, certain she would decline, afraid to step into the spotlight without the armor of his name. But as the song continued, he found himself leaning forward, the room's noise fading. This was not the Genevieve he remembered. This was not the woman who had stood beside him, quiet and accommodating, content to shine only in private. She was radiant, untouchable, and she wasn't singing to him. Sloane clapped politely beside him, but her eyes flicked toward him with a faint trace of irritation. She had noticed it too, the way the room's attention had shifted, the way even she, with all her careful poise, seemed to vanish in Genevieve's light. By the time the applause died down, Christopher knew the truth, though he would never say it aloud. Whatever hold he once had over Genevieve Miller was gone. Her image, her presence, her power had slipped beyond the reach of his influence, out into a world that adored her for reasons that had nothing to do with him. The next morning, Genevieve walked through the main square with Adrian, and their conversation was easy and unhurried. People stopped to greet her, praise her performance, and thank her for visiting the Springs. She accepted it all with a gracious smile, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Across the square, Christopher stood with Sloane watching. She didn't glance his way once. And in that moment, beneath the bright flags of the Spring Festival, Christopher Smith, the man who had always believed the world revolved in his orbit, felt for the first time what it meant to be on the outside looking in. The warmth of Blue Water Springs had hardly faded from Genevieve's skin when the storm arrived. It began as such storms often did, not with thunder, but with whispers. At first, she noticed a subtle shift in how particular academics spoke to her, polite, but with an edge of hesitation, their eyes assessing her as if weighing unspoken rumors. By the second week back at Harvard, those whispers had hardened into something more tangible. Articles in obscure industry newsletters, anonymous posts on academic forums, a string of insinuations that felt all too familiar. She hadn't earned her place. She'd charmed her way into Caltech's fellowship. And the ugliest of them all, she had traded favors for scores. Genevieve didn't need to guess where the smoke came from. She could smell the cologne. But this time, it wasn't Christopher's direct doing. The threads traced back to another player, Harold Winslow, an aging titan in the energy sector, and one of Christopher's fiercest competitors in the corporate arena. Winslow had reasons to damage Christopher's image, and Genevieve was an easy pawn with her sudden rise and her past connection to him. By smearing her credibility, Winslow's network could undermine her and Christopher's reputation for backing exceptional talent. To them, she was a scalpel, aimed at Christopher's legacy. It was a cruel irony that a feud between billionaires was now dragging her name through the mud again. The morning the second wave of allegations hit, Adrian found her in the engineering library, the pale winter light falling across a table strewn with her research notes. He dropped a stack of printed screenshots in front of her. "They've escalated," he said. She looked through them. Forum threads dissecting her publications, suggesting her data was too perfect to be genuine comments dripping with condescension, disguised as academic skepticism. "They're not just coming after my work," she murmured. "They're coming after my right to even be here." Adrian leaned forward, his eyes steady. "Then we don't just defend, we counterattack. You have nothing to hide. We force transparency. How we request a full public review of the fellowship admission process, your scores papers every stage. We show them every step you took to get here, making it impossible for anyone to twist the truth." It was bold, risky, but the thought of cowering under the weight of lies was worse. "Do it," she said. A week later, the Harvard Faculty Council, in cooperation with Caltech's Fellowship Board, convened an open interview session, a rare move in academia that drew supporters and skeptics into the largest lecture hall on campus. The air was electric. Professors lined the front rows. Graduate students crowded into the back. Journalists from niche science publications scribbled in their notebooks. Genevieve sat alone at the long oak table in the center. Her posture composed, her charcoal suit understated but sharp. Adrian sat off to the side, his expression calm but alert. The session began with procedural formalities. Her scores, letters of recommendation, and research proposals were projected on the screen for all to see. The numbers spoke for themselves. Her entrance exam score, 98.7%, the highest in the fellowship's history. Her publications cited in multiple peer-reviewed journals. Her independent project on superconductive polymers lauded as industry-disrupting in its methodology. Still, the murmurs persisted. Numbers could be explained away, detractors said. They wanted proof of her intellectual agility, evidence that she could think beyond prepared papers and memorize data. About an hour into the session, Dr. S. Luis Delgado, a renowned physicist and known skeptic of celebrity scientists, leaned forward. "Miss Miller," he began, "let's test the boundaries of your thinking. I'll pose a problem, one that has gone unresolved for years. You'll have no access to notes or calculators, just your mind." The hall went still. He described a theoretical challenge in quantum materials, a scenario involving temperature stability in layered superconductors under fluctuating magnetic fields. The problem was so infamous that even senior physicists had set it aside as unsolvable with current models. Genevieve listened, without interrupting her pen, motionless in her hand. "Do you understand the question?" Delgado asked. "Yes," she said. She reframed the problem aloud, breaking it into its fundamental components. Then, without rushing, she sketched a diagram on the provided board, layering her explanation with analogies accessible enough for students to follow, yet precise enough for the professors to respect. Instead of approaching it through the conventional thermodynamic pathway, she pivoted, integrating principles from polymer chain flexibility, research from her independent studies into the equation. Murmurs rippled through the audience as the model took shape. Delgado's brows drew together, not in skepticism now, but in focus. When she reached the end, she placed the marker down. It's not a complete solution, she acknowledged. However, it offers a predictive model that reduces the error margin from 22% to under 5%. That's enough to design a viable test. For a moment, there was silence. Then Delgado stood slowly and began to clap. One by one, the rest of the board rose to their feet. The sound built echoing off the high ceiling until it filled the room like a wave. The next day, every academic journal worth its ISSN number reported on the event. Headlines framed her not as a scandal, but as a breakthrough mind. The live stream of the session, particularly her handling of Delgado's challenge, circulated widely clipped and subtitled in multiple languages. The smear campaign evaporated under the weight of her public performance. Even her harshest critics were forced to admit the elegance of her thinking. Winslow's circle went silent. For Genevieve, it wasn't just vindication, it was liberation. She no longer carried the shadow of having to prove she belonged. She had done it publicly, undeniably on her terms. In Manhattan, Christopher Smith watched the footage in his office, his jaw tight. He had seen her win before, in debates, in quiet, personal arguments, but never like this. This was a victory she had carved entirely without him. And for the first time, he wondered if his presence in her life had been less a foundation and more a cage. The first crack in the Smith family's immaculate facade came not from a rival company, nor from a political scandal, but from the quiet persistence of facts no longer willing to stay buried. It began with an investigative report from the Atlantic Ledger, a publication known for dismantling reputations with surgical precision. The headline, stark against a black and white portrait of the Smith Tower, read, "The Hidden Empire, Inside the Smith Family's Web of Influence." The article was more than a hit piece. It was an autopsy. It detailed years of corporate manipulation, back-channel deals, and carefully planted media narratives. It named names: Christopher's father's covert political donations in exchange for deregulation policies, his mother's silent acquisition of competing media outlets, and most damning of all, Catherine Smith's admission into Harvard's graduate program through a chain of bribes disguised as alum grants. It was the latter that caught fire fastest. The public could digest corporate corruption. It was expected, almost accepted. But buying academic prestige was the match to a dry field in a climate already raw from debates about fairness and access. Screenshots of bank transfers, emails from intermediaries, and even internal family messages leaked evidence that the Smiths had not only greased the wheels for Catherine, but also actively smeared competitors, including Genevieve, to keep her from outshining the family name. By the end of the first news cycle, Smith Global's stock had dropped 12%. By the end of the week, it had plunged 30%. The New York Stock Exchange floor buzzed with talk of the scandal brokers, gesturing sharply, their voices rising over the din. The Smith Tower's mirrored windows, once a symbol of power, now reflected an uneasy skyline, one where their name no longer inspired awe, but distrust. Investors demanded explanations. Brand partners suspended collaborations. In private shareholder forums, anonymous posts discussed whether the family should be removed from day-to-day operations. Christopher faced the board of directors in the top-floor conference room, the Hudson River stretching beyond the glass behind him. "We need transparency," one member said sharply. "And we need it now. The market doesn't forgive ambiguity." "Transparency," Christopher replied evenly. "We'll expose vulnerabilities in our competitors as well." "This isn't a chess game," another board member snapped. "It's triage. You're not here to counterattack, but to stop the bleeding." The implication was clear. His leadership was under review. Christopher kept his face unreadable, but inside something twisted. He had weathered hostile takeovers, recession dips, and even personal losses splashed across tabloids. But this was different. This wasn't just about him, the Smith name, the dynasty. And the narrative was slipping beyond his control. At Harvard, Catherine's expulsion was swift and public. The university, eager to protect its reputation, stated within hours of the Ledger article, "Effective immediately, Catherine Smith is no longer enrolled in Harvard's graduate program for material science." The decision follows a thorough investigation into university admissions policy violations. The phrasing was surgical, but the subtext was brutal. "You didn't earn your place, and now you've lost it." Photographs of Catherine leaving her Cambridge apartment, hair unkempt, and sunglasses failing to hide swollen eyes, filled gossip sites. Where once she had been the smiling darling of charity galas, she was now the emblem of entitled downfall. Christopher could not move publicly without cameras clicking like a swarm of locusts. Reporters camped outside Smith Tower, blocking the entrance, their shouted questions sharp as thrown stones. "Mr. Smith, did you authorize the smear campaign against Genevieve Miller? Do you still deny the bribes to Harvard? Will you resign as CEO?" His security detail kept the press at bay, but their presence only reinforced the image of a man under siege. Worse still, photographs surfaced of him with Sloan Armitage at Blue Water Springs, the captions framing them as vacationing while the empire burns. It didn't matter that it had been a business trip masked as leisure. The optics were poison. And through it all, Genevieve Miller's name appeared in a different light entirely. Publications that had once reduced her to a former companion of billionaire Christopher Smith now hailed her as an example of resilience. Editorials praised her for dismantling false accusations through intellect and composure. The New York Times ran a feature titled, "Beyond Survival: How Genevieve Miller Redefined the Narrative of Women in the Shadows." It was more than a profile. It was a manifesto against the quiet, corrosive form of control the Smiths had embodied, the kind that made people like her believe they had to be grateful for the privilege of existing in someone else's story. The article's most quoted line came from Genevieve's interview. "People call it a breakup. I call it an exit from a glass cage. I didn't just leave him. I walked back into my life." Those words spread across social media, paired with photographs of her at academic conferences. Her smile unguarded, her posture certain. She unintentionally became the face of a movement advocating for women who had been sidelined in professional and personal spheres by partners wielding power as control. Late one night, Christopher sat alone in his office. The city stretched below, but the light felt colder than in years. He watched a news segment replaying Genevieve's words. Her voice was steady without malice, but each syllable felt like a blade. For the first time, he considered a truth he had resisted, that she had not been a figure in his story. He had been a chapter in hers. And that chapter had closed. The fall of the Smith image was not sudden, not catastrophic in the way explosions are. It was slower, quieter, like a structure rotting from the inside, until one day the weight could no longer hold. And when it collapsed, the dust did not rise like the old dynasty. It scattered, leaving only the outline of what once was, and the space where something else, someone else, was now standing in the light. The autumn evening was painted in amber and smoke when Christopher Smith stepped out of the black sedan onto the quiet Cambridge street. The air was crisp enough to sting his lungs, but the knot in his chest was far more suffocating. In his pocket, he felt the weight of the object he had carried for 3 days, without the courage to deliver a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, passed down through the women of his family, each stone set by hand in an antique platinum band. For 3 generations, it had been a symbol of permanence. He was here to give it away if she would take it. Genevieve's apartment door opened after the second knock. She stood framed in the doorway, backlit by the golden lamplight from inside. Her hair was a little longer now, curling gently at the nape of her neck, and she wore a soft, loose sweater, the kind that whispered of warmth without effort. Christopher. Her voice held no surprise, but no invitation either. Genevieve. Can I come in? Just for a few minutes. A pause long enough for the quiet to stretch before she stepped aside. He didn't sit. He couldn't. Standing in her living room, surrounded by books and plants, and the faint smell of bergamot tea, he felt like he had entered a world that had learned to breathe without him. I'm not here to argue, or to bargain. He began, his tone unusually steady. I'm here because I've spent months, no years, thinking I could replace what we had with money, power, or someone new. And I can't. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes didn't leave his. I had the procedure done, he said abruptly, a vasectomy. I wanted you to know. I won't betray you again. There won't be anyone else. The words sounded almost desperate in the air. He reached into his coat pocket and opened the ring box to reveal the vintage piece glinting under the lamplight. This belonged to my grandmother, he said quietly. I was supposed to give it to the woman I wanted to build my life with. I should have given it to you years ago. I didn't. And that was my first mistake. For a moment, the only sound was the soft tick of the clock on her bookshelf. Christopher, she began, her voice calm, but threaded with something heavier. When I left you, I didn't do it because I wanted to punish you. I left because I couldn't breathe. I left because I'd forgotten how to exist outside of your shadow. He swallowed hard. If you love me, really love me, then let me go, she said, her gaze steady, almost kind. I have an entire sky now. A life that belongs to me, not someone else's idea of who I should be. And you? She hesitated, her tone sharpening just slightly. You need to learn how to respect women before you can claim to love one. The words landed like a final gavel in a courtroom that had been in session for years. Christopher stood motionless, the box still open in his hand. The certainty that had propelled him here drained out, leaving something rawer, something unarmored. For the first time in his life, he understood the cold, hollow sensation of being refused, not for lack of wealth or status, but because the person standing before him had chosen herself over him. He closed the box slowly, almost reverently, as though sealing away the last vestige of hope he had carried. Good night, Genevieve, he said finally, his voice low. He walked out into the autumn night, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot the only sound. The car door closed with a muted thud, and as the driver pulled away, Christopher caught one last glimpse of her through the window, already moving back into the warm light of her world, one he no longer had the right to enter. And for the first time, the man who had always dictated the terms of love, business, and life itself understood what it meant to lose without negotiation. The air in Pasadena smelled different, lighter, infused with citrus blossoms from the trees lining the streets. The late afternoon sun spilled gold over the sandstone facades of the California Institute of Technology, turning every shadow into something soft. Genevieve Miller stepped out of the administrative building, a slim folder of official papers in her hand, her Caltech doctoral program enrollment confirmed. It felt almost surreal the way life had circled back, not to where it began, but to where it was meant to go, before she had been diverted into someone else's orbit. Her apartment overlooked the San Gabriel Mountains, their outlines etched sharply against the sky. She brewed her coffee on a small balcony each morning, watching the mist lift from the ridges. There was no penthouse skyline now, no gold-trimmed elevator doors or glass walls stretching over Manhattan. And yet, this view felt richer because it belonged entirely to her. Her research proposal had been accepted within weeks. The ambitious project might take years to complete, applying quantum material dynamics to renewable energy systems. It was the kind of work that had always lit her from the inside out, even when she'd been quietly sketching formulas on napkins between Christopher's meetings, waiting for him to remember she existed. 6 months into the program, Genevieve submitted a manuscript for peer review, a synthesis of 8 years' worth of observations, problem-solving, and midnight calculations that had lived first in her mind, then in her battered notebooks. The acceptance email came on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was so simple, "Decision on your manuscript," that she almost missed its significance. When she opened it, her breath caught. "We are pleased to inform you that your paper will be published in the upcoming issue of Nature." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. This was the journal she had read in libraries late at night as a student, the one that had felt like a universe away. And now her name would be printed in ink to outlast her. The university organized a small ceremony to honor contributors to high-impact research. It was formal enough for tailored dresses and champagne, but intimate enough for everyone to greet each other by name. Genevieve wore a navy sheath dress and the quiet confidence of someone who had rebuilt herself brick by brick. She accepted her award under the warm applause of peers and mentors, the sound filling the vaulted room like a slow tide. When she stepped off the dais, she caught sight of someone at the back of the room, Adrian Bennett. He moved toward her through the small crowd, wearing the same quiet smile she remembered from their Harvard days, though there was something steadier in it now. "I wouldn't have missed this," he said when he reached her. "You've made history here." She laughed softly. "It's just a paper, Adrian." "No," he replied, his voice lowering. "It's a door, and you kicked it open." They stood for a moment, in the low hum of conversation around them, and then his expression shifted gentler, more deliberate. "I love you," he said, "but you're free. Always. That's the only way I'd ever want it to be." The words settled between them like something living. She didn't answer with a promise or a rejection. She only met his eyes, letting the truth of his respect sink deep where old wounds had once been. Later that night, back on her balcony, Genevieve opened her journal. She'd kept one for years now, not for formulas or equations, but for the notes that mapped her inner landscape. On a fresh page, she wrote, "In the book of your life, men are only chapters with an ending. You are the author. You write the last page." She underlined it, once closed the journal, and looked toward the mountains. They were dark silhouettes against the velvet sky, their peaks hidden in the night. Somewhere beyond them, more doors waited to be opened. If you had asked her years ago where she saw herself by this age, she might have answered with someone else's name attached, someone else's vision of what her life should look like. But now her future was untethered, not drifting, but deliberately charted. And maybe that was the real story. Your life is your book. No one else gets to write your ending. And if you've ever been made to feel like a side character in someone else's plot, remember you have the pen. The next page can start today. Like this story, share your thoughts. Below your voice matters here. And if you believe in writing your ending, stay with us. More stories are waiting for you.